So this is the fourth installment of the four-part stability series in your apiary. So we're going to cover the last couple of topics, and then we're going to go into just a quick recap. Tonight's talk may not be quite as long as the other ones, but hopefully we'll get through a few more things. Maybe that'll help in your beekeeping. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is getting ready for winter. Now, winter is the most stressful time for our bees, no doubt. The rest of the year is fine. Wintertime comes, there's a lot of stress on our bees. So we have to do everything we can to make sure that those bees do as well as they can through winter. There's a few tasks we need to do going into winter. Now, when is winter? In my area, I really say winter starts in probably December, but I've started my winter prep back in October. In October, after I pulled my honey supers at the end of September, my fall flow is pretty much over. I use October to do a couple of things. Number one, I'm going to make sure that I've got enough reserves in this colony. I'm going to have probably my area 2 deeps or 3 mediums as my brood chamber. So I'm going to make sure that at least the top deep box is completely full of honey, and most of the frames in the bottom, but we want some cluster area. Or if I'm running mediums, I want the top 2 boxes to be filled with honey, and the bottom again to have a few frames of honey and some cluster area. So if they're not full, we have to feed them. Now, you have to remember about feeding liquid when you start getting into those cooler temperatures. The bees need to dry that nectar, or call it nectar, call it sugar water, call it commercial pro sweet, whatever you're feeding them, whatever that moisture content is, they've got to get that down to 18.5% moisture, just like honey. That takes time, temperature, and in the fall we don't have a lot of either. So you don't want to feed liquid too late into your fall. I start as soon October 1st or end of September when I pull those supers off. I check to see how full I am, and I immediately start feeding. Now, whatever I'm using, if I'm using a commercial feed, it's already 77% solids. I don't have to do anything. If I'm feeding liquid sucrose, I'm going to dissolve as much sugar into that water as I can. Now, when you make sugar water, never boil it, never heat it when the sugar's in it. You can get the water hot, or pretty warm or hot, and then dump the sugar in, stir it around. You never want to boil it; it'll create some toxins in there. It'll kill your bees, actually. So mix it as thick as you can and start feeding that colony so those bees have time to pack it into the cells, break it down, pack it in the cells, dry it out, and cap it. So we're going to get our brood nest full of honey, ready for winter. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to do a final mite check. We're going to go in and do a mite count on a few of your hives, depends how many you have, but at least sample a few of them, see what your mite count is. If it's around 3 or so, you might want to do a quick treatment of something, a formic acid or oxalic acid or one of the thymol-based, to knock a lot of those mites off before we go into winter. Now, they're not going to raise a lot of mites in the winter because we don't have a lot of brood, but it's still good to get that count down for next spring. We do that final mite treatment and get that hive ready. So now we've got them relatively mite-free, and we've got them all fed up. Now remember, that mite treatment is just your final knockdown. Never do your first treatment in the fall. As we talked about in the earlier sessions, it's really important to get those colonies relatively mite-free by the end of August. That's your major treatment, should be sometime before the end of August, and be mite-free. And we're just going to do a little cleanup in October. So we've got this colony now. We've got it full of honey. We've got it relatively mite-free. We're going to start getting it prepped for winter. One of the things we want to do is we want to put a mouse guard on. Mice love going into colonies in the wintertime, especially when the bees are in cluster. If the bees are flying actively, the mice won't go in there. But, when it's cold and they're all in cluster and barely moving, the mice move in there, and anybody that has had a mouse in their colony will tell you that they ruin a colony. They can kill the bees themselves. They will urinate and they'll defecate in that colony. You will not get that smell out. The bees don't like that smell. It's tough, putting a new colony in if it happens to be a dead out, or the colony itself won't like it. It'll take them a while to build up because they're cleaning that out. You'll find a mouse nest in there, and if you're lucky, there'll be babies in there. You get rid of those. So put your mouse guards on. I usually wait. I don't want to trap a mouse in my colony because I don't get mine put on until usually about the end of October. And by then I'm having, mornings where there's frost on the ground, cold nights. So I wait till midday when it's warm and the bees are actively flying. When they're flying in and out, I know there's no mouse in this colony. That's when I'll go through and I'll put my mouse guards on and secure them. So we have this colony treated for mites. We've got it fed up with syrup or sugar water. We've got our mouse guards on. Now we want to talk about probably the biggest killer over winter time. The biggest killer is, without a doubt, moisture in the colony. And if you just close your hive up tight, don't leave a little ventilation in there, you'll come in the spring, those bees will probably be dead, and it'll be all wet and moldy, and they're very damp. So we need to deal with that moisture. The bees give off a lot of moisture in the wintertime, and we're going to do some things to make sure they have ventilation. One mistake a lot of beekeepers think is they come into a colony in the springtime and they'll say, my colony froze. In most of North America, not all of it, there's some very cold areas in America way up north, but in most of North America, our bees, it does not get cold enough to freeze our bees. As long as we sent them in with that cluster, they can keep warm, they can keep moving. They don't freeze, they starve to death. What happens you've sent them in with that small cluster, they're too cold to be able to move that cluster up. They can't move, so they're immobile. The bees in the center consume the honey underneath them, they can't move to new honey, and they actually starve in place. And you'll know that when you go into your colony in the springtime and you'll see those bees with their heads in the cells, their butts are sticking out, and where that dead cluster is, within an inch there's honey there. That tells you that they starved out, they didn't freeze. So we're going to not worry about freezing, we're going to worry about moisture. And as I said, moisture will build up in this colony if we close it up tight. The bees give off a lot of moisture just like we do when we breathe. And what happens is in our colony, if we close it up over winter and do nothing, that moisture is going to condense on the bottom of the inner cover. And if it's below freezing, it's going to build up a frost layer. And that frost layer will grow a bit thicker all through the winter time until we get that first warm day. And it'll melt that frost. And what happens is you've got ice cold rain dripping down on your bees. And that's an absolute killer for your colony. That will absolutely kill those bees. So we have to manage for that. There's a few ways we can do it. We can do straight ventilation. A couple of years ago, I had a colony that I was using a lid that was very warped. It was a migratory cover. I didn't have an inner cover on it. And I actually sent it into winter with a gap of about this much on it. It's probably a good inch on the one side. When I came into spring, I looked at it and I assumed that hive was going to be dead. It was one of my best colonies. The bees were fine because there was no moisture buildup. They had a good cluster and they had plenty of honey. So don't worry about closing them up. Don't worry about not letting air in there. We actually want air to come into this colony and we want to take care of that moisture. So how do we take care of it? One is ventilation. This is a wintering cover. So with this wintering cover, it gives me a couple options. Because it's recessed in here with this rim, I've got the ability to feed on top of these frames. If I need to feed my bees late in the wintertime or early spring, I can put some sort of feed on top of here, whether it's dry sugar or a winter patty or fondant. I've got room to do it. And I put this on there. It's got a hole in the front here. I could take this plug out for ventilation to come out. That will help us quite a bit for getting ventilation through this colony. Now, another thing we can do is we can provide some sort of a barrier and a moisture absorbent material to soak up some of that moisture. So if I were going to take this, send it in with this shim on it, I have a few options. One is I can place some sort of moisture absorbing material on top of this inner winter cover. This, if I put it on top like this, the moisture will come up through the middle of that hole and it will soak up into this fiber board. So that moisture's soaking up on here, and this does give us a little bit of insulation between the bees and the outside temperature. So it's got that little bit of a temperature break in there that helps. The moisture gets soaked up in here so we don't get that dripping on the bees. There's another method we could do. And you could do, there's a lot of different ways we can take care of moisture in our colony. This is just a piece of our insulation. This insulation, again, creates that barrier between the warmth inside the colony and the cold air outside, so we don't get that frost layer building up. We'll still get moisture in here, but it won't be freezing as much on the top. Hopefully a lot of it will escape through here or wherever we've got our ventilation. I'll sometimes put little sticks underneath the cover here, just a little bit to let air out of there. We can actually do both. A lot of people don't do that. You can, I don't, but you can. You can put the moisture board on top. You put this piece of insulation on top of the moisture board. It's just that little bit of extra insurance. And then we just would put our outer cover on there. And that'll give us moisture absorption and insulation. That's one way to do it. As I said, there's a lot of ways we can do this. Another piece of equipment that is relatively new, but a lot of people are using it and they like it a lot. They say it works great. It's called a hot box. This is what it looks like. Got a little screening material here, insulation in the middle, all the way down to the bottom side. And it's got ventilation holes on it, I believe on the front. You can put them on the front and the back. It probably doesn't matter because there's so much insulation here. Wouldn't matter which way you do it. And what this does is it lets that moisture come up through the colony into that insulation, and it'll get absorbed into that insulation. We've got the airflow out here. It'll gradually move that moisture out of the colony. These work great. I'm getting great reports on these come springtime. People are saying, yeah, I went in there, no moisture issues, my bees look great. So you might want to look at something like this. Again, it's got, you see it's got these little wedges in the corners. And what that does, when we put our outer cover back on, we've got this little gap here. That air that comes up through this hot box is going to come up and come out on top of the, underneath this outer cover. So that's another method of dealing with moisture. Now, a question I get asked quite a bit is about wrapping your colonies. And I always tell people, is wrapping necessary? No, it's not. Does it help? Absolutely. Anything you can do to give the bees the edge to keep a little bit warmer in there. And if you think about it, the difference inside that colony, if it's 10 degrees because you've wrapped it, when it's 0 degrees outside or so, maybe a little bit warmer than that. If you've got it wrapped, it might be 10, 15 degrees, 20 degrees warmer inside that colony. Might be enough to let that smaller cluster move up to get that to that new honey so they don't starve in place. So we've got a lot of options for wrapping our colonies. There's products out there. This is called the Bee Cozy. It's black plastic, and inside of it is insulation. You wrap it around the colony, and it just stops wind from getting through. It gets that thermal warmth from the sun. When your late winter sun hits that, it'll warm the outside of this a little bit. So that's an option you can use. Another option is something called, it's just a winter cover. Again, plastic, black plastic. Inside is foam board for insulation. It's just attached by Velcro. And this one is actually for an 8-frame box. It would do 1.5 stories pretty much, or almost 2 if you lift it up a little bit off the bottom. And that'll wrap and insulate the colony as well. Again, are these necessary? They're not absolutely necessary, but do they help? They absolutely do. And I always say it's cheap insurance for your colony. So I always recommend that you do whatever you need to do to make sure that that hive can always get to new honey and there's not a moisture issue in the colony. So when you look at your colony in the fall, you can tell how strong it is. It's when you look at it, say October, it's not going to get any stronger from that point on. So that's the strength you base on what you're going to do to that colony. The smaller the cluster, a smaller cluster, you absolutely probably want to put a wrap on it. A huge cluster, maybe you don't have to. Huge cluster, you might want to really look at their food resources because they're going to go through more. So that's all we have to do for winter. The only other thing we need to do is we need to occasionally come out to this colony over the winter time. And as I said, I always do it when it's somewhere in the 30 degrees. I don't open my colony if it's colder than that. But once the temperature hits about 30-ish during the day, I'm going to come out to that colony through, usually I start doing it late January if I get a day like that. From that point on through March, I'm going to come out, lift this cover, and take a look to see, number one, if it's alive, and number two, where the bees are. If I see they're on top of these frames, if they're already up here, they're out of food. I know I've got to feed them. So I, have my rim on there, my wintering inner cover, so I've got room to put feed on there, and I can take care of that. So we want to monitor that through the winter time until we get to spring. So we've covered everything that we need to do to get into winter. And like I said, plan your winter. I start planning my winter, August, September, October, the things I want to do. Start making a list and get prepared of everything you want to do. Then once we're into winter, the last thing we need to do is plan for next year. There's not much we can do in our colonies. I always sit down and I make a list of the mistakes I made this year, the things I want to do next year to fix that, or new things I want to try. I make a list of equipment I want. If I'm going to start maybe grafting more queens next year, or I'm going to make more nukes, I tend to get my equipment in the winter time so I can have it all painted up and ready to go come spring, because we all know, we say we're going to wait till spring, we're going to buy it then, but you get into spring, you're busy with a lot of other things, and before you knew it, you didn't get any of it done. So I use winter time as a time to take care of all my plans, get my new equipment, and I clean up my old equipment. I'll go in there and I'll scrape all my frames and get rid of all the propolis in the boxes, scrape that off so everything's nice and clean, ready to go for spring. Weed out my old, the frames that they've raised multiple brood cycles in over the years that are really dark. If I hold them up, you can't see light through the foundation. To me, that's time to get rid of that frame. So that's all I was going to talk about today as far as what we need to do. So we've covered everything, so I want to just do a quick recap so we know the things we need to do to be successful. One, come January, February, we're going to start planning for the season, and we're going to start looking at our colonies. And as I said in the first session, when we start this planning and looking at our colonies, this is when you're going to make those notes to say this colony, okay, it's a dead out, or it's just ticking over, it's a small cluster, but it's there. Or we've got this big cluster. We've got a nice big cluster in there. The big clusters, we know we're going to have to split. As we get closer to spring, we're in maybe March, now I'm going to order my queens. I'm going to start planning, based on the size of these, the end of March, I know when they're going to need to be split. I know about when my dandelions are going to bloom. If it's a late spring, my dandelions might not bloom until end of April, beginning of May. If it's an early spring, they could bloom middle of April. So I'm going to monitor that. I'm going to order my queens. I'm not going to make any. I'm not going to let the bees make them, because we talked about lack of drones, weather that doesn't cooperate, it's cold, it's rainy, and no nectar flow. Because we need drones, we need a good nectar flow, and we need weather where the bees can fly consistently so the drones can fly and the queen can go out in her mating flight. So in the springtime, let's buy our queens to be on the safe side. We move into April, May. We're going to split our colonies. We're going to get those queens, the ones that are booming, we're going to split them. We could either do a 1-for-1 split. We could just pull a nuke out of it to weaken it a little bit to stop that swarm instinct or mitigate it somewhat. We're never going to get rid of the swarming instinct. We just want to try to manage it. We're going to make that, so those bees swarming, we're going to make that nuke. That's our swarm. We made the bee swarm. We got the colony. It didn't end up in the tree or in the neighbor's, his bee yard. So we're going to do that in spring, and we're going to probably do a mite count. I like to go into a few colonies, do a few checks to see where I'm coming into spring on my mites. It's always a good thing to know through the season how your mite count changes. And it's something I think everybody should do, whether you do it, even if you did it once a month, on one hive, check that mite count every month so you get an idea of how those mites change, the counts change through the season. So we're going to do all of that. And the last thing we're going to do, obviously, is we're going to wait for that nectar flow, and we're going to put our honey supers on. One thing that, I don't know if I mentioned it in the other session, when we super up our colonies for honey, the old adage is over super in the spring, under super in the fall. When we come into spring, we can put as many boxes on as we want. If the bees don't fill them, they don't fill them. We pull them off. What the full ones, the empty ones, pull them all off, and we're fine. We got a lot of time. In the fall, if you put too many honey supers on, the bees will fill those supers, and they won't put honey in this brood nest to get through winter. So I'm always very cautious depending on where my flow is. In the fall, I might have a goldenrod aster crop, that's one crop, or I might have a knotweed, that's one crop, or I might have both crops. One's August, one is September. If I've got both in an apiary, I'll put 2 supers on. Otherwise, I go with 1 to be safe. So we're coming now into the honey flow. It's on strong. We're getting into, in my area again, June. We know the flow in my area is over the beginning of July. This is when we think about making our overwintering nukes. So we go into those colonies. We find those eggs in that brood that's never going to gather nectar for us, right? Know your nectar flow. I can't stress that enough about knowing your nectar flow, basically when it starts and stops. I know mine again, July 4th, it's pretty much over. First week of June, I'm going to start maybe making nukes. I'll start grafting queens maybe a little bit before that, maybe around the 1st. I'll make my nukes on June 14th. Somewhere in that area in the first 2 to 3 weeks of June, I'm making my nukes to overwinter. I'm pulling a lot of those nurse bees out and a lot of that brood out. I want the foragers to be left in that mother colony to bring me in honey. And I've started my nukes. Now with nukes, I don't know if I touched on it. When I start a nuke like that and I've grafted a queen, once they get established, that queen starts getting a nice brood pattern in there, I may treat that colony for mites to get a mite free in the nuke. So we come into the end of our nectar flow. Again, July for me, whatever it is for you. I pull my honey supers off. I'm going to treat this colony for mites. I've got about 50 days where I've got no flow from first week of July through about the 3rd week of August. I know I've got all that time to clean up my hives and get them mite free. And that's what I'm going to do during that period. Get them all cleaned up, get that mite count way down, but I'm also going to keep them raising brood. We talked about nutrition. We talked about what those bees need to raise brood. We talked about the whole chain, right? The nectar, the carbohydrates, the pollen, the protein, combined make bee bread. The bee bread is consumed by the nurse bees. They make the royal jelly from that gland in their head, the hypopharyngeal gland, and they feed every single larva. So we've got to make sure during whether it be a nectar dearth or a dearth of pollen that we are providing that nutrition. If it's one or the other or both, we're providing it with a sugar water mixture, a commercial syrup mixture, or a pollen substitute of some kind. We're keeping these bees raising that brood through that nectar dearth. We want to keep them strong. So we get to the end of summer. We've treated our bees for mites. They look good. We've kept them raising brood through that period. Now, in that period as well, it's a perfect time if you've got a colony that's just maybe not raising a lot of brood. They've got everything they need, but they're just ticking over. We get queens that just do not raise a lot of brood for some reason. Perfect time to requeen that colony. You can order a queen, you can make one and graft one, you can let the bees raise one and replace it in this colony. Good time to requeen colonies that just aren't performing, because we get those every year too. So we get to the end of summer. If you've got a fall flow, you're going to put that super or 2 on there, gather your fall flow. When it's over, pull those supers. I see a lot of times, especially relatively new beekeepers, they will try to get every drop of nectar into those supers, and that's a mistake, because the bees in my area, like I said, July 4th, it's over. Well, there could be a nectar flow that trickles for the next week or 2. There's a little bit coming in, not a lot, a little bit, and they leave those supers on trying to gather that, and now they've lost 2 weeks, treating for mites or doing whatever else they need to do. So don't do that. Take that honey off when the major flow is over and take care of those hives. We're going to come into fall. Again, we're going to pull that fall super off if you have a fall flow. If you don't have a fall flow, once you get into summer, that's a good time to feed those bees. And if you have a little bit of a fall flow, maybe you could make a nuke or 2 or do a split. Very, very difficult after the 4th of July to make splits that make it. They just don't have enough time to get through those 2 good brood cycles to get enough bees in that colony. But you can be done if you really work at it. But we get into fall. We're going to start thinking about winter. That's where we're going to feed, right? We got to feed in that month where there's still enough warmth. still enough sun that those bees could dry that nectar out to that 18.5% or lower moisture content. So we've got these brood boxes filled for winter, our 2 deeps or our 3 mediums or whatever configuration you're running to overwinter. And even if it's 1 deep, we want to make sure they're pretty full of honey. We can do that final cleanup on those bees. We can go in with a light treatment. We don't have to do anything heavy. We can use a thymol based, we can use a formic acid, we can use an oxalic, anything like that to just knock any phoretic mites off of those bees that are walking around, and just get them good and cleaned up so we start nice in the springtime. And then the last thing we're going to do is that winter prep, which we just talked about. Mouse guards to keep the mice out. We're going to make sure that they've got their feed, they're full, that mite treatment, and we're going to manage moisture and warmth maybe. Moisture's the biggie. We're going to do one of these methods to make sure that we get a lot of ventilation through this colony so that they don't get that moisture buildup inside the colony and actually drown in that cold rain on our first thaw. And that's about all we do. Then I close mine up. I usually said I don't wrap. Every once in a while I'll wrap just to test and see the difference, which I recommend to everybody. If you ask me, should I wrap my colonies? It depends how many you have. If you have 4, I would tell you wrap 2. Then you won't ask me that question again. You'll have your own results. And that's something that I don't think enough beekeepers do. I tell everybody, if you want 3 colonies to make honey for you, or whatever your reason is for keeping bees, you want 3 colonies, have a 4th or a 5th so you can do some experimentation. Nobody will find out better if a wrap works good in your area than you doing it yourself. The same thing with the different style of wintering covers, the moisture control, the raising brood, anything. You need colonies to play with. I'm lucky. I get a lot of colonies here at work that we have, so I can test anything I want. I can try anything I want. Some of these things you'll see on the internet or you'll read, they sound great. You try them in the bee yard and they kill your bees. You end up with no bees. That's not a good thing. You should listen to what you've discovered and what worked for you. And I encourage everybody to do a lot of, playing around with their bees, trying things to see if it works for you. So that's all I've got for today. Again, I hope you picked up a tip or two maybe that's going to help in your beekeeping, to help you be more successful this coming year. I've heard there are a lot of bee losses out there. If you lost bees, don't just say my bees died. When you go into that colony, try to figure out what they died from, right? If there's no bees in there whatsoever, or they're all dead on the bottom board, very good chance you didn't take care of your varroa back in July and August. Very good chance. If you go in there and they're, heads are in the cells, butts sticking out, they're in a small cluster like this, and there's honey this far away, the cells are empty, but up above that it's all capped honey, they starved. Why did they starve? You sent them in with too small of a cluster. Well, why? What was it? What was the reason they went in with that small cluster? Did you not feed through the dearth? Did you not take care of the mites? Remember, mites shorten that lifespan. 1 mite, 20 to 40% cut in lifespan. 2 mites on a bee, 40 to 80%. So we want to make sure we understand how our bees died. You can look at a frame, you can see where the mites, they defecate in the cells. You'll see little white crystals on the inside of the cell, sticking on the cell wall. If you see that all over the brood nest area, after those bees are gone, you know you had a lot of mites in there. So look at your colonies, figure out why they died. If you don't figure it out, you're going to do it again, right? You didn't manage for moisture. If you don't know moisture killed them, you're going to do the same thing the next year. So never waste a dead hive. Look at it, learn from it, so you don't do it again. Once again, thank you for joining us in these Facebook Live sessions. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Sometimes I get to them a little late, but I'm trying to get to them within a couple of days. Post your questions up there and I will answer them. And if you have a particular topic that you'd like to hear about or more about, I can try maybe to do it on Facebook, or maybe we'll just do a video and try to post it to our website so you can watch it.